HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents RAF, The Birth of the World's First Air Force, by Richard Overy, Ph.D. Read by Stephen Crossley. Preface. The Royal Air Force was formally activated on the 1st of April 1918, April Fool's Day. It was an inauspicious date on which to launch the world's first independent air force, and there were hesitations about choosing it. Perhaps the Army and the Royal Navy, both for their own reasons wary of the fledgling service, quietly approved the choice of date, hoping that a separate air force would soon prove itself a joke. They certainly both hoped that the RAF and the new Air Ministry it served would not last beyond the end of the war. In this, they were soon to be disabused. The RAF survived victory in 1918 and has survived regular calls for its dissolution since, and now celebrates an uninterrupted 100 years. The birth of the RAF was surrounded by argument and controversy. There already were two air services fighting Britain's aerial contribution to the First World War, the Royal Naval Air Service and the Army's Royal Flying Corps. The establishment of an entirely new branch of the armed forces was a political decision, prompted by the German air attacks on London in 1917, not a decision dictated by military necessity. The politicians wanted a force to defend the home front against the novel menace of bombing, amidst fears that the staying power of the population might be strained to breaking point by the raids. From the politicians' viewpoint, the air defence of Great Britain was one of the principal charges on the new force, and it is the defence of the home islands 22 years later in the Battle of Britain that is still remembered as the RAF's finest hour. The reality of the past 100 years has been rather different. The RAF has principally served overseas, and for most of the century was a force dedicated to bombing and to ground support for the other services. This future was anticipated in the final 7 months of combat in 1918, when the RAF, building on the legacy of its two predecessors, contributed substantially to the air support of Allied armies in Western Europe and the Middle East, and organized the independent force, independent of the front line, for the long-range bombing of German industrial towns. By the time of the armistice in November 1918, the shape of RAF doctrine was already in firm outline, even if its future as a separate force was thrown into doubt once the fighting was over. The birth pangs of the RAF are the subject here. Founding a new service in the midst of a bitterly contested conflict raised all kinds of practical questions which had to be resolved, from the colour of uniforms to the very name itself. The long history of the RAF as an institution was given shape in the earliest days of its existence. There are numerous records to help reconstruct those early days, and a wealth of memoir and historical literature to draw on. I am grateful for the help I have received in the archives and libraries I have exploited, and for the encouragement of the staff at the RAF Museum at Hendon, where I have been privileged to chair the research board. This volume is a small contribution to the wider programme of commemoration in which the museum is engaged. My thanks as ever to my agents, Jill Coleridge and Cara Jones, and to Simon Winder and the team at Penguin, and particular thanks to one of my colleagues on the research board, the head of the Air Historical Branch, Sebastian Cox, for his sound advice on an earlier draft. Needless to say, the views expressed throughout are my own, as are any errors of fact or interpretation that might remain. Richard Overy, Exeter and London, 2017. 1. Britain and the War in the Air. A fixed determination to attack and win will be the surest road to victory. RFC Training Manual, 1913. In 1908, Only 5 years after the Wright brothers' first powered flight in December 1903, the British novelist H.G. Wells published The War in the Air, in which he imagined a near future when aircraft would decide the outcome of modern war. The novel's hero, Bert Smallways, watching the destruction of New York by German airships, reflects on Britain's vulnerability. The little island in the Silver Seas was at the end of its immunity. Aircraft changed the whole nature of war. Writing 25 years later in his autobiography, Wells noted with a grim satisfaction that he had written the novel before any practicable flying had occurred. But he had been correct to predict that aircraft would abolish the traditional divide between a military front line and the home population, and so erode the distinction between combatant and civilian. With the arrival of aircraft, Wells concluded war was no longer a vivid spectacle for the home front, watched like a cricket or baseball match, but a horrible reality for ordinary people. Only 7 years separated Wells' novel from the first bombs to fall on British soil, and only 10 from the establishment of the Royal Air Force, set up to try to protect Britain's vulnerable people from an air menace described so graphically by Wells at the dawn of the air age. One of the many remarkable consequences of the coming of powered flight was the speed with which the armies and navies of all the major powers sponsored the development of aircraft, both dirigibles and aeroplanes, for military purposes. The technical development of aircraft in the decade following the Wright brothers was exponential, and knowledge of the new invention universal. But for the British people, all but immune to invasion for a millennium, aviation posed a particular strategic threat. This perhaps explains why the evolution of military air power in Britain in the age of the Great War was strongly influenced by public opinion and political pressure, and was not solely a result of the military need to respond to innovation. Critics at the time and since have blamed military conservatism for the slow development of organised air power in Britain before 1914, and have assumed that public disquiet, noisily expressed in the popular press, prompted a grudging army and navy to explore the use of aircraft despite harbouring strong prejudices against their use. The Army and Navy were, in truth, less narrow-minded than the popular image suggests. The first powered flight in Britain was only made in 1908 by A.V. Roe, who managed a distance of just 60 yards, 55 metres. A mere 3 years later, the Army began developing a military air arm when the Royal Engineers established an air battalion, consisting of a company of airships, still considered a major factor for the future of air warfare, and a company of aeroplanes. On the 13th of April 1912, the King issued a royal warrant for a new service, and a month later, on the 13th of May, the battalion was replaced by the Royal Flying Corps, RFC, the direct ancestor of the future RAF. The corps consisted of a military wing, a naval wing, a central flying school, and a reserve, loosely controlled by an air committee with representatives from the two services. A small cluster of soldiers and seamen who had qualified as pilots joined the force. The RFC adopted a modified khaki army uniform and the Latin motto Per Ardua ad Astra, through adversity to the stars, still the motto of today's Air Force. The intention was to keep a unified corps serving both the Army and the Royal Navy, but when Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1913, he exploited his personal enthusiasm for flight to insist that the Navy should have a separate air force. The first commander of the Royal Naval Air Service, RNAS, was Captain Murray Souter, the director of the Admiralty's Air Department. In July 1914, the RNAS was formally divorced from the RFC, just as Europe was about to plunge into war. A year later, the Admiralty assumed full responsibility, a bifurcation that was to lead to endless friction between military and naval aviation, until united as awkward rivals in the RAF in 1918. In the same month that the RNAS was created, a military aeronautics directorate was established by the War Office to oversee the military wing of the RFC under one of the pioneers of Army aviation, Major General David Henderson. Both the Navy and the Army understood that aircraft were likely before long to become assets indispensable to their operations. "In view of the fact that aircraft will undoubtedly be used in the next war," wrote the Chief of the Imperial General Staff in 1911, "we cannot afford to delay." The Army Field Service Regulations, published in July 1912, were the first to contain reference to the use of aircraft, and in the 1912 field exercises, 2 airships and 14 aircraft were used for reconnaissance purposes. The observer in one of the aircraft was Major Hugh Trenchard, the man later regarded as the father of the RAF. Commander of one of the armies in the exercise was Douglas Haig, who later formed a close working relationship with Trenchard on the Western Front. By the summer of 1914, on the eve of the Great War, a major RFC training exercise saw experiments in night flying, flight at high altitudes, aerial photography, and the first attempt to fit machine guns to an aircraft. The RFC training manual issued the year before stressed the need for offensive aviation well before the means were available. It was nevertheless true that the RFC was a considerable way behind the development of aviation elsewhere. In France, Austria, and Germany, rapid progress had been made in military aeronautics. The small Bulgarian Air Force was responsible for inventing the first modern aerial bomb. And in 1914, the Russian engineer Igor Sikorsky developed the multi-engine Ilya Muromets Sikorsky Type 5 aeroplane, the first modern heavy bomber. British services were slower to respond, partly because they did not anticipate a major European war, partly because public and government were fixated on the battleship arms race, and partly because the British Army was so much smaller and less politically powerful than its continental rivals. When war broke out in August 1914, the RNAS possessed only 6 airships and 93 aeroplanes, many of which were unserviceable, and could field only 1 flying squadron, the word chosen in 1912 to describe the small air units being formed. The RFC arrived in France with the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, with just 4 squadrons totaling approximately 60 aircraft. There were 105 officers and 755 other ranks. The French Army put 23 squadrons in the field, the German Army 29. The first 2 years of war provided a steep learning curve for air forces on all sides. Aircraft technology improved all the time, but aircraft remained fragile objects, subject to frequent damage and repair. They were constructed chiefly of wood and fabric, carried a heavy metal engine, and were held together with wire or wooden struts. Some idea of the nature of early aviation engineering can be gleaned from the trades assigned to each RFC squadron, which included 2 blacksmiths, 6 carpenters, 4 coppersmiths, 21 riggers, and 4 sailmakers. Flying was an exceptionally hazardous undertaking with few base facilities, primitive navigational instruments, and the constant threat posed by sudden changes in the weather. Naval aviators were occasionally sent off over the sea, never to be seen again. Diaries kept by servicemen in the RFC talk repeatedly of the cold. Aloft, in an open cockpit, thousands of feet up, the temperature was debilitating. The RFC training manual in December 1915 listed the clothing pilots and observers were expected to wear to combat the intense cold. 2 pairs of thick long drawers, a woolen waistcoat, a British warm coat with a waterproof oilskin over it, a cap with ear pads, 2 balaclavas, a flying helmet, goggles, a warm scarf, and 2 pairs of socks and gloves. Although the RFC manuals stressed that aircraft could accomplish little or nothing in heavy rain, fog, gales, or darkness, pilot records showed that flying continued even in cloudy, cold conditions with limited visibility. Advice on weather in the Air Force Field Service Book was rudimentary. Red at sunset, fair weather. Red at dawn, bad weather or wind. Pale yellow at sunset, rain. Crashes and accidents were as a result routine occurrences. British Air Forces lost 35,973 aircraft through accident or combat during the war, and suffered the loss of 16,623 airmen, either dead or severely injured or prisoners of war. A diary kept by an air mechanic during the later war years gives a vivid description of a typical accidental death. Lieutenant J. A. Miller was taking off in an SE-5 when he crashed. His machine caught fire, and he was burned to death. We were powerless to help him. The ammunition in his guns and boxes was exploding, and bullets were flying around. Soon the fire died down, and his charred remains were taken out of the machine and buried in a wood close by. A wooden cross made out of a propeller marks his grave. The situation in the first years of the war was not helped by the poor level of training of novice pilots, many of whom would have only 20 hours flying time or less before being posted to operations, where only 2 hours would be spent learning to fly the front-line aircraft assigned to them. A young John Slessor, later Chief of the Air Staff in 1950, recalled that he was commissioned as an RFC pilot with just 12 hours solo flying, and was fortunate to survive. There were no parachutes. The RFC and the RNAS were military midgets compared with the other branches of the Army and Navy, and it was still not entirely clear what aircraft might achieve in the context of a major war. All experience prior to the war suggested that the principal function of aircraft, whether aeroplanes or airships, would be reconnaissance of an enemy's military or naval forces, and for much of the 4-year conflict, the supply of intelligence became an essential and central function of all Air Force operations, military and naval. The most important role of aeroplanes in war, according to the 1915 Training Manual, is reconnaissance. Moreover, as one senior RFC officer claimed in 1917, aircraft reconnaissance is the most perfect and the most complete it is possible to obtain in war. This was true only to an extent, since reconnaissance operations were often interrupted by poor weather, while aircraft could be destroyed by ground fire and hostile planes, or disappear altogether at sea. Reconnaissance involved observation of enemy troop movements and dispositions, but as trench warfare set in, aircraft were also used to spot enemy artillery and to direct the artillery fire of their own forces. This became an increasingly sophisticated operation as the war went on. Aircrew used either the target battery line, when they could see both the objective of fire and the guns doing the firing, signalling by wireless the number of yards the shells were wide, short, or long, or the clock code system, where the observer placed the enemy target at the center of an imaginary clock face, 1,000 yards wide, and signaled back the time and distance to the gunners on the ground, who had a map and a clock face disc to enable them to locate the target with greater precision. On a static front line, with artillery duels a regular feature, directed gunfire became indispensable. Reconnaissance was nonetheless only one of the functions aircraft were expected to perform. In the first days of war, RFC pilots and observers practiced using pistols or rifles to attack enemy aircraft engaged in observation. Soon, machine guns were fitted to most aircraft, so that those on reconnaissance could protect themselves from attack. By the end of 1915, RFC manuals classed counterforce operations, fighting against other aircraft, as a key function, without which other duties could not be carried out. The relentless offensive against the enemy air force became a primary objective as the war continued. The third major task was support of surface forces, whether ships at sea or troops on the ground. For the RFC, this involved destruction of materiel and demolition at vulnerable points on the enemy's communications, and offensive action against troops on the ground. Ground support operations were conducted using bombs and machine guns, but from very early in the wartime career of the RFC, it was assumed that the impact on the morale of enemy troops was more important than the physical destruction possible with small 20-pound bombs, an assumption that came to be embedded in British air doctrine for a generation. Independent bombing operations, however, were still not regarded as a significant element in air warfare. The RNAS is generally credited with launching Britain's strategic bombing when, at Churchill's prompting, a handful of naval aircraft attacked the sheds and repair facilities of the German Zeppelin airships. On the 22nd of September 1914, 4 planes attacked targets in Cologne and Düsseldorf, with little effect. On the 8th of October, 2 more attacked and struck a Zeppelin hangar, destroying airship LZ-9. On the 21st of November, the Zeppelin factory at Friedrichshafen was attacked by a number of small Avro 504 single-seat aircraft, capable of carrying just 4 20-pound bombs. It was, Churchill told the House of Commons, a fine feat of arms. And indeed it was remarkable that targets were found and attacked so far from the front line, given the limitations of current aviation technology. But the raids were tiny, and the impact in the end insignificant. The RNAS continued to plan for independent bombing operations against German military targets. In May 1916, No. 3 Wing was established to undertake long-range bombing more systematically. But the Battle of the Somme that summer forced the diversion of RNAS aircraft into assisting the Army. Between October 1916 and April 1917, the wing undertook 12 small raids on targets in Germany, but was then disbanded, with little achieved, and the aircraft again diverted to the land battle. Where bombing mattered in the first years of war, it was against targets at or near the front. But even here, its effect was marginal. As the air services grew rapidly in size in the first 2 wartime years, new organizational structures had to be created. In November 1914, the RFC was divided into 2 wings, the first wing supporting the British First Army, the second wing supporting the Second Army. A third headquarters wing was added in April 1915. Each army had an aircraft commander attached to it to maximize coordination between Army and Air Force. The level of expansion made it necessary to create brigades, composed of at least 2 wings, and 8 were formed between 1916 and 1918. Each wing was made up of 2 or more squadrons, each squadron of 3 flights of 4 aircraft each. Brigades were retitled groups after the war, but the basic organizational structure of the later RAF was already in place well before its formation. The headquarters of the RFC was established in northern France at Saint-Omer near the Channel coast. The site was a small chateau, overcrowded and improvised. There were no electric lights and inadequate accommodation for serious staff work. My main recollection wrote Maurice Baring, recently appointed to the RFC staff, is a stuffy office full of clerks and candles and a deafening noise of typewriters, a perpetual stream of guests and a crowd of people sleeping on the floor. Among the uncomfortable guests was Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Trenchard, commander of the RFC military wing at home, but in November 1914 made commander of the newly formed First Wing. Baring met him at the quayside at Boulogne to take him to Saint-Omer. A tall man, with a small head and a Scots Fusilier's cap on. Trenchard played a central role in the history of both the RFC and the RAF, but in autumn 1914 he might just as easily have ended any prospect of a major new air service, when, as commander of the military wing, he had recommended, with support from Sefton Branca, Henderson's deputy in London, that the RFC be divided up between the Army Corps and divisions, each with their own assigned air units and with no central commander or headquarters. The proposal was quashed after protests from Henderson and his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Sykes, who had been Trenchard's predecessor as commander of the military wing. There was little love lost between the two men. Sykes was a punctilious military intellectual, at home in the world of politics and diplomacy, more than capable of articulating his views on air strategy and organization, and confident that his view was the right one. He was regarded by some as aloof, cold, and devious, by others as too able for his own good. Trenchard, Sykes claimed in his memoirs, was an officer with a forceful personality and great drive. But he thought on the bigger issues Trenchard was fundamentally wrong, not only in 1914, but later in the war when the two men, one after the other, became Chief of Staff to the fledgling RAF. Trenchard in turn thought Sykes secretive, kept everything hidden, and never spoke to anyone, though he did concede that Sykes was a hard worker and had some brains. Sykes' dislike of Trenchard persisted long into retirement. He was the only one of Trenchard's surviving contemporaries who refused in the 1950s to be interviewed by Trenchard's biographer. Other airmen had more generous opinions of a man affectionately known as Boom because of his deep, resonant voice. After army service in the Royal Scots Fusiliers in India, South Africa and Nigeria, Trenchard learned to fly at the age of 39 and became deputy commander of the Central Flying School, run by the naval aviator Godfrey Payne. When his future Chief of Staff, John Salmond, arrived at the school as a young trainee pilot, he later recalled seeing a dark, glowering man with a parchment-coloured face and a light behind the eyes. It was not long, Salmond continued, before I knew what the fire meant. Trenchard was respected as a commander who worked fearlessly without flagging, cared for his crews despite the sacrifices he demanded of them, and single-mindedly defended the organization he commanded. He attracted great loyalty, but colleagues learned that at times he could display a harsh temper and a deliberate brusqueness of manner, masking a lonely inner self. Unlike Sykes, he was ill at ease in the world of politics and instinctively distrusted civilian interference in military affairs. He has always enjoyed the reputation of being inarticulate in speech and on paper, though he generally knew what he wanted. "I know I am an untidy talker," he told his biographer, "and you may say I have an untidy brain, but in my mind I am persistent and consistent." His commitment throughout the war was to pursue strategies that would facilitate army victory. As it turned out, he was an unlikely father of the RAF. Up to the last, he opposed the formation of the new service in 1918, even after he had reluctantly been pressured into accepting the role of Chief of Staff. Trenchard, for his part, regarded David Henderson, first Director of Military Aeronautics, as the true father. In August 1915, Trenchard replaced Henderson as Commander-in-Chief of the RFC in France.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?